empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal divided up the world. And they were very active in terms of exploring the world and taking our lands illegally that were already occupied by indigenous nations worldwide. So they went to the Pope of the Catholic Church to validate the illegal taking of the lands. And what did the Pope do in the 14th century? He issued a papal bull. The papal bull provided instructions that indigenous peoples are not human or Christian. Because indigenous people are not human, they don't have sovereignty in government.
I remember reading it and thinking, that doesn't make sense. How can you simply take over somebody's territory by saying you no longer exist or you never existed because we didn't know about you?
It wasn't until I was older and starting to educate myself on our history and what had happened and why our communities are in these states was when I heard the Doctrine of Discovery for the first time. So I just remember reading it and thinking, like, this can't be real. This isn't something that makes sense. This is something that's like inhumane and just not something that was fair to the people that were the protectors of this land.
Another word for this is terra nullius, empty land. And the land is made empty not by clearing the people out, but it's made empty through law.
Chief Justice John Marshall basically said, in simple terms, we are sovereign because of the Doctrine of Discovery. We have the right to govern this land because we discovered it. And he wasn't talking about we in the American sense, he was talking about we in the white man sense. And that therefore, those nations that were here, those Indian nations that were here, are now semi-sovereign nations. So they're no longer sovereign. They are dependent upon our sovereignty, our willingness to let them retain some elements of sovereignty.
It's relevant because not only is it basically the root of the whole structure of property law in Canada and the United States and Australia, for instance, but it is thoroughly enmeshed in the structures of our law so deeply that it's often difficult to even spot it.
This fiction, this hidden foundation still lives with us because we don't assume, by and large, that Indigenous peoples today are primitive or have lower social skills on this kind of hierarchy of civilizations. But nevertheless, the law continues to assume that sovereignty of the Crown is paramount, that Crown title is underlying all of our land, when in fact that comes from nowhere. It comes from just an assertion.
The underlying question is how, in the Canadian context, for instance, where does the Crown get its right to hold underlying title for all lands, which is the way that our law is structured? Where does the Crown get its jurisdiction over all matters? And there's this sense that this came out of the ether, it was always thus. Starting at the time of the first colonial incursions into the Americas, there had to be justification. Why did the colonial powers have the right to take over these lands and assert their sovereignty or their jurisdiction? What did they do about the fact that there were people here already who were living in, using these lands, exercising their own laws, having their own political structures? There had to be some sort of justification to allow that colonial authority to be asserted.
Sadness surrounds me, traveling through Aboriginal homeland, see things that others can't. Longhouses, smoke bellowing from its center, surrounded by wooden palisades. Brown woman tending to 3 sisters, the corn, the beans, the squash. Men wandering through the bush, hunting for deer and other sustenance. Children running through the woods, playing games, laughing. Mohawk River flows, Creator's artery, bringing fish for harvest, a waterway for travel. Can smell the sweetgrass, the strawberries, the first fruits of summer.
We occupied the whole Turtle Island, US and Canada, North America. And our nations and our people were granted inherent rights by the Creator.
It wasn't an empty land, and there were lots of government sort of structures. The Mi'kmaq had different provinces. They used to come together on, regular meetings. The 5 nations and then the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. These were people who were mostly farmers.
In Ontario, it's estimated that there was about 90 to 110,000 people living here when the Europeans came in. When the Jesuits, for instance, came in 1615, along with Samuel de Champlain, encountered the Wendat people, the Huron. There they lived as 40,000 people between what's now Barrie, Orillia, and Collingwood. And they were in villages of 2,000 people, and there were 200 miles of roads that were connecting these villages.
And there were trade routes everywhere. They found parrot feathers in the Arctic. The trade routes were the incredible way of getting around and ensuring that people were able to survive. So if you've got all of this territory in corn from the early Haudenosaunee peoples, and you've got northern hunters with moose meat and deer meat, and there's going to be trade. This area was settled because of the wealth of the waters as well, not just the land.
We were highly organized and structured in our governing systems, and we had the kinship clan systems of the various nations on Turtle Island, and really major functions, duties, and responsibilities of each of the clans in the kinship clan system that formed the basis of how we structured our governing systems.
The essence, though, of the clan system is that you respect the gifts that different people bring. And so some people are really good hunters, and some people are really good cooks, and some people are really good with money, and some people are good intellectuals. And the essence of the clan system is you respect what each of them bring, and collectively we figure it out.
What I often refer to is who made the laws, who made the rules. The female side, the grandma, the moms made the rules in the family, the home, and the community. And as men, we had to enforce them.
The whole concept of buying and selling land was a foreign concept to us. We didn't believe in it. We didn't believe that the land could be bought and could be sold, and that we were letting people use the land, and it was not a permanent transfer.
It is about thriving cultures with political structures, with their own legal norms, with their own systems of exercising jurisdiction, with their own property laws. And many of those societies continue to today. So a really wonderful example of that in a Canadian context right now is the archaeological discoveries that have been confirmed in the within the last 2 years on the BC coast. So in the area of the Heiltsuk First Nation. One is the excavation of a 15,000-year-old village site that the Heiltsuk community today knew about. So within their living memory, they knew that this was a place that their community had used 15,000 years ago and had continued to use for the past 15,000 years.
But then I see blood. My ancestors covered in red lifelessness. Settlers' blood too. Who was right? Who was wrong? Both wanted good life, good land. Now I see farmlands. Wonder if they grow the Three Sisters. see hard pavement that was once soft trail, good to walk with deerskin moccasins. Old stone buildings and homes carved out of once pristine land now replace longhouses and a good, creator-given life that was before.
Over the years, 50 years now that I've been walking that way, so I've met many First Peoples but I've been able to develop relationships with them as people. I began to learn the facts, the truth, the history. The fact that we signed treaties, that the Indian people, as we talked about Indians, had been here for thousands of years, and we were the newcomers among them, and we were the people who came and lived within their territory, their homeland, and they accepted us as neighbors. They were willing to take us in.
There's an innate respect in our people for everyone and everything, because everyone is a creation of the Creator, is created by God. Therefore, that's an automatic respect. And so we just went along with them and helped them get along and helped them survive.
There's a complicated set of factors that broke this relationship that was quite strong at one point. Settlers needed Indigenous peoples for knowing about the land, how to survive, food. Often it was just men coming along, and so there was partnerships formed, and the children were mixed between European and Indigenous parents, and that went on for 250 years in North America and was quite strong and developed distinctive cultures in many of those places. I think what started to erode that was the development of a mercantile system that could alienate or separate people from one another through trade that then had war attached to it.
Canada has not got the reputation the United States has, where there was a lot of killing and shooting and burying of bodies. In Canada it was a little more subtle. These people that were here were in the way. And so how do we remove these people in a way that isn't bloodletting, but confines them someplace else? And so that was the remove people from their lands, put them in a space where we can contain them, control their access to resources. With MacDonald, John A. MacDonald, our first Prime Minister, it was let's just starve them to death. If they can't eat and they can't survive, they can't make babies, they can't continue.
Of course, if you want to disorient any population, the first thing you must do is somehow break their contact with the land. Because the land on which they live is the source of their identity, their medicines, their food, their ability to self-sustain.
And then that didn't work, so let's just take their children away, and we'll teach their children how to do things our way.
Let's help them by taking their kids from them and raising them in Western ways. And so you take them in, you strip them of their clothes, you shave their hair, you douse them with lye, you put them in identical clothing, and when they try to speak their languages, you put pins through their tongues, you punish them corporally, you tell them that their parents aren't and their communities aren't worthy of emulation.
Can you imagine a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old taken from their parents, institutionalized, and then everything good about being a First Nations person is no good? Their beautiful long hair was cut. Their beautiful languages weren't allowed. Their access to their families and their ceremonies were disallowed. And everything they've known, the pride in who they were as a First Nation, it's no good. Your family's no good, your community's good, your nation's, First Nation's no good. In fact, you're no good. Then on top of that, you put on that physical abuse, then sexual abuse and mental abuse. You are not healthy coming out of that institution.
The doctrine of discovery is something that we could say clearly was behind the residential schools because it was about Christian and European superiority and the notion of remaking Indigenous people in that image. For their benefit was the perspective, for their benefit either in this world or the next. And we know the impacts of the residential schools didn't stop with the closing of the residential schools, that those impacts spilled over into generations and are causing intergenerational trauma even to this day.
My grandfather had to allow his kids to be taken from his home, or he'll get his treaty card taken away. I can't remember what it is, but it was something that was that important. And for a man to see his kids getting taken, just makes me like scared. Like, how would I react if that was me with my kids or anybody else's kids? How could you live the next day? And then that's where that addiction comes in, because you're weak and you're sad and there's nothing to you don't have your spirit is lost.
I carry my parents' hurt. And I'm the first generation that didn't attend residential school, and I think what is hard is that I still hear their stories, and to know their pain and suffering is the saddest thing.
I think virtually all the social ills in Indigenous communities today are the result of the disorientation that occurred for Indigenous populations because of that residential school era. And it's primarily an emotional and spiritual dislocation. Yes, it was physical and economic and social and other kinds of dynamics like that, but for Indigenous people ourselves, it's that emotional, spiritual disorientation that becomes a major complication in life.
And for me, I've always said it's about the loss of spirituality, the loss of knowing who they are as Indigenous people, Indigenous youth. And that goes, that's one of the legacies of the residential schools. So a lot of our young people don't know who they are.
And a lot of our men don't have, traditional culture. They don't understand where they came from. They don't really speak about it anymore. Yeah, so it's really sad. Like with the residential schools, there's a lot of impacts. Right to abuses, like physical, mental, even like lateral violence and all of that stuff. It's really sad.
Martin Brokenleg talks about us, the need to belong to something. And if your family has been destroyed, your family life has been destroyed through drugs and alcohol, then you don't have a family. You don't have a family to belong with. So therefore they may go where they can find a family, such as gangs or other negative influences like that.
Read Rupert Ross's Indigenous Healing. Essentially what he says is that the first generation of Indigenous children going into schools were so overwhelmed, they simply shut themselves off emotionally. And of course, as a therapist, I've seen that happen for lots of people, but certainly with Indigenous populations, and it's the right thing to do. If you're a vulnerable kid or a vulnerable adult and life is simply overwhelming, it's probably best just to shut down. hunker down and hold on, because that's what that generation did. But there's a cost. And the cost is you never become skilled in managing your own emotional world. And then you can't teach those skills to your children and to your grandchildren. And when people can't manage themselves emotionally, they drown those emotions with alcohol, numb them with drugs or busyness or sex, or they turn those unmanaged emotions inward and they become depression and suicide, or they turn them outward and they become vandalism and violence. All those issues that we see, the pathologies that we see in Indigenous populations, I think Ross is right. It's one of the legacies. It's the psycho-emotional and spiritual displacement that is the equivalent of the land displacement that the Doctrine of Discovery is trying to generate in the first place.
Aboriginal communities are profoundly affected by the issues of institutional racism in the penal system. 5% of the Canadian population is Indigenous, 25% of the men and 35% of the women in penal institutions are Indigenous. In parts of the country it's higher. In Manitoba, 65% of the men in Stony Mountain are Indigenous, and I believe it's now about 90% of the women in Headingley, which is the women's prison in Manitoba. Those are shockingly disproportionate levels of incarceration.
Today we have new kinds of stressors. We have the missing and murdered Indigenous women. In the last 70 years we've had child welfare, and those are kind of adding to that already toxic stew that's been generated over the course of time. So intergenerational effect, or legacy effect, is something that I also call it, is about people not having the opportunity to sit down and have a discussion about what's going on in their community, within themselves, within their families, and actually being able to process that to the extent that they can say, I can take a big breath here. I know there's not something terribly wrong with me. I'm actually suffering from something that has been handed down through generations because we have not had the opportunity to resolve.
The Doctrine of Discovery is the principle that all the underlying title to property, all the underlying authority and jurisdiction rests with the colonial crown.
It's a legal fiction. I spent much of my life as a therapist, and it's stunning when a client realizes they have lived much of their life with an illusion. Like, for example, I can't sing. People will say, well, the truth is most people can sing. It's because if you ask them, who told you you cannot sing and how old were you when they told you that, they'll be able to identify both. It's when in fact they were a vulnerable child that someone said to them, you cannot sing, and they believed it. And so then they build their life experience on that illusion. Well, that's what Western culture has done with the Doctrine of Discovery. It has built a reality. It's set up legal precedent. It believes it is true, but it is a legal fiction.
The Doctrine of Discovery, as you know, has been validated by the Supreme Court in the U.S. for implementation. And because the English common law system applying in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of India, that Supreme Court decision applies here, and it continues today.
The Crown has not recognized Indigenous sovereignty. We still, by and large, have this Indian Act. The Indian Act was passed in 1876, designed to assimilate us. It's still the law today, and there's been very few amendments from that almost 150 years ago, 140 some odd years ago to this point. The Indian Act is archaic. It's designed to make Indians into good Victorian citizens of kind of the 1870s. Its very purpose is to erase the presence of Indians through their attrition and then teach them how to be like good citizens of that once upon a time era.
The form of laws constructed for Indians today, based on those objectives of the Papal Bull, the Doctrine of Discovery, and those Empire Canadian colonial policies, have resulted in systemic racism in the laws of Canada for Indians. I often laugh when they say, oh, we have Indian laws. There's Indian laws. Those aren't Indian laws. Those are laws made by Canada respecting Indians. It's not our law.
How do you take a whole population of people on a national scale and tell them that they have no right to make a decision? The idea was, we will make the decisions for you. We will make decisions about housing, we'll make decisions about economics, we will make decisions about your education, and if you have a decision to make, we'll make that decision for you too, right? You don't get to make any kind of decision without actually going through us. And the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs still has the authority to make those decisions, still has to resolve questions around bylaws. I have a will, I have a job, I have a car, 2 cars, I have a house. But if I died this week, the minister still has the power to change my will if she so desires, as of today, now.
Indigenous people are falling between the cracks of federalism. If we think we're trying to solve something, we ask the federal government to do it, and they try to apply their authorities, or we ask the provincial governments to do it, and they try to apply their authorities. But that's still other people making decisions for us as Indigenous peoples. What we need is some place where our authorities are recognized, and yes, we'll make mistakes, but we'll also then correct our mistakes like all other governments do. And if we don't correct them, right, there's going to be consequences for that. That needs to be a part of the way we think about our relationships.
We've won hundreds of Supreme Court decisions, and the latest one being the Williams decision, the Chilcotin decision. The Supreme Court said Aboriginal rights and title are recognized for, like, we've always said that. Now we have the highest court of Canada, Supreme Court of Canada, saying the same thing. We have the judicial branch of government, the legislative branch of government, and the executive branch of government. So you have the judicial branch of government clearly saying something that we've been saying for years, that Aboriginal rights and title are recognized. We've always had it. We have pre-existing rights as Indigenous peoples. We have the judicial branch saying that. If the legislative branch keeps up with that now, they have to get in line with what the judicial branch is saying. So I mean, all the laws have to keep up. The executive branch, the policies have to keep up. So if the legislative and the executive branch don't keep up with what the judicial branch is saying, you have a disconnect. So we have to really work hard and in partnership, in a collaborative way with this government to fix all their illegal and racist laws and policies. And that's a lot of work, but it can get done. That will really be reconciliation in action when that happens.
What do we want our country to be built on? Do we want it to be built on this notion of others, people being inferior? Or can we build our country on the idea that we can agree and we can find ways to persuade one another? And I think that persuasion is more in line with our Canadian values.
To me, being Métis is being twice blessed. I'm part of 2 family trees that are rich. My First Nation grandmothers and my grandfathers that were often from Scotland or Orkney Islands, England, and there's also the French Métis.
In Canada, prior to Canada becoming Canada and provinces becoming provinces, the Métis people arose in what we refer to as the historic Northwest and developed their own distinct language, culture, identity, known as the Métis Nation, often referred to as Riel's people. What you see along the routes of the fur trade, in particular in the Northwest, is these distinct communities emerge, but in particular in the Red River settlement area, a coalescing of an identity, a nationhood. Those peoples, and what is a people in international law and domestically is there's a common language, there's a shared history, there's a territory, there's a collective consciousness where they assert themselves as a people. And of course the Métis were not here at first contact. They emerged as a distinct people on the plains nearly 200 years ago, and that is who the Métis people are.
Are you Métis? It's not only being of mixed ancestry, it's more than that. It's about identifying with the culture and participating as you're able, right?
What the Métis story, though, is it's really a story of denial, neglect, and not recognizing that that is a people. Interestingly, they did when they needed us back in 1869 and 70. There was no way through what is now Manitoba without dealing with Riel's people at the Red River settlement and Métis people pushing back and saying, no, you will deal with us. And that begat the Manitoba Act and the promise of 1.4 million acres of land in what used to be the postage stamp province of Manitoba. That peoplehood was recognized. You treated nation to nation, government to get that deal that brought Manitoba into Confederation, and then allowed for treaties to be negotiated in the rest of Western Canada, as well as the rest of Western Canada to be brought into Confederation. What Canada did, though, was had amnesia of, well, we recognized you as a people, we had this treaty relationship, nation to nation, government to government in 1869-70, but we got what we wanted.
As the railway was going across the country, land was becoming more precious, and Métis people were asked to leave, right? They didn't have the right title to a land, so it was like, well, it's not yours, you must leave. So there's that land piece.
Métis have had to go to court to prove that they have rights, and they're defined by colonial courts, right? They're defined in a way of not, and as a right by right perspective. Doctrine of discovery assumes Canada's got it all, and you've got to pull it down jurisdiction by jurisdiction, right by right, what we will recognize or accept. And I think that still plays out for the Métis daily.
The concept of the Doctrine of Discovery has always been a part of Métis life, the impact of that, but having it named, that was an important moment for me, to have it named.
It's kind of interesting. It's like one of those sci-fi movies that it takes different forms all the time, whether it's the Indian Act or whether it's denial of Métis rights, and we don't realize it, right? And to a certain extent, Canadians are fed it in different ways, right? It's the idea that you hear, the negative comments you hear of, oh, well, we're giving First Nations, Métis everything, those sorts of comments where it's not a recognition of Canada's built upon these solemn promises and relationships that we've been doing a lot of sharing over the last 150 years, and you're seeing it from the view of, well, because you discovered, you've got it all.
There's a lot of work that has been done, but there's a lot of work left to be done. But the Métis are still here, yeah.
Inuit are not First Nations and we're not Métis. We are one of the 3 Indigenous peoples of Canada, and we are part of a global Indigenous community. We are a minority Indigenous population within Canada, and often Canadians know nothing about us.
When I come down here to the schools to talk about our way of life in the North, they say, children ask me, do you live in igloo? Yes, we do. I do live in igloo, but on the 2nd floor. In my part of the world, well, we do not have any say as to what we should do in our lives. It was all governed by the people from the South.
After World War II in the early 1950s, that's when massive change had happened at an incredible speed. So forced relocations, coerced settlement into communities, children being taken from families for residential school, entire populations being taken for TB treatment in the South. The killing of our sled dogs once people were coerced into communities. Imposition of people who were responsible for us in those communities through basically an Inuit-style Indian agent. All of this happened in such a short period of time in many parts of the Canadian Arctic. We do not fall under Canada's Indian Act, and we have modern treaties, which are very different than historical treaties or other First Nations groups that don't have any treaties at all. We co-manage about 3.5 million square kilometers of this country, about 35% of Canada's landmass. And we have self-governments. We have created a territory through Nunavut, through our land claim agreement in Nunavut. So our reality is underpinned by a very different reality than most First Nations.
The changes are coming rapidly right now to the north, where people are taking ownership of themselves and to their land and how they should govern it. They're trying very hard to stand up.
The underpinning of what we see as normal today and the treatment of Indigenous people, the way we imagined, the way Canada or the United States imagined land, governance, respect for rights, all is underpinned by these foundational documents, especially the Doctrine of Discovery. Only about 16 to 18% of our Aboriginal title-held land becomes fee simple land that's owned by Inuit. And we don't have full access to subsurface resources or offshore resources the way that other nation states do. And that is all a product of the way in which the Doctrine of Discovery influenced the way governments thought about us and the way that the general population thought about Inuit. It isn't just looking back and apologizing for something that doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore. It is a narrative of a relationship, and you can get beyond the challenges that we faced in the past. We can get beyond the human rights abuses that we have endured based on this doctrine if people understand what it meant, why it changed our societies the way it did, and how the repudiation and now working with Indigenous people and working with Inuit and respecting our self-determination demands that we stop and pause and say the way that we understood the world was wrong. Anything that we can do to tell a narrative that is truthful to the past and hopeful for the future with the respect that's necessary to us as a people is essential in reconciliation and also just in being a good, loving person and a part of a good and loving society.
We are left with Gunalunkwa, the great love from the ancestors. And with that, we go on to grieve and heal, to be strong like our ancestors, to keep the good mind.
First of all, we've got to open ourselves to listen to the truth. And we've got to accept the fact that the truth of our relationship from the First Peoples' point of view is a different story altogether. And there has to be healing. We must find ways to keep talking with one another, sharing with one another, and allowing healing to happen before there can ever be reconciliation.
There's a huge gap between what is experienced by settler communities and what is experienced by Indigenous people in terms of health, in terms of threat of violence, in terms of education levels, in terms of rates of incarceration. There's this gigantic gap.
This gap has to close. That's reconciliation. Because this gap represents everything we talk about. It represents the 80+ boil water advisories. It represents the 1,200 missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. It represents the 40,000 kids in care, First Nations children in foster care. It represents a disproportionate number of our people in jails. It represents our overcrowded housing, the 5 to 7 times the youth suicide rate. All these negative things, that's what this 6th versus 63rd gap represents.
If you think that Indigenous people are a problem to be solved like poor people are a problem to be solved, some people think, or anybody else who's experiencing oppression or a problem to be solved, then there's a possibility that you're paternalistic at best. And paternalism and racism are on the same continuum, right? It starts off, and this is the story of Canada, it starts off as good intentions.
There are people that say, why should Indians be any different? Why should we treat them in accordance with these treaties or these special constitutional rights? Why don't they just get on with it? You know, my ancestors came here from England or Scotland or France or the Caribbean, and yes, the first generation was hard, but we've made it better for ourselves. Why don't they just do that? Which ignores the fact that we're being held down from doing that. It's true that we can leave our reserves and go to the cities, but all these structures of terra nullius travel with us.
They've taken a lot from us. A lot of our stories, we were an oral people. You know, they've practically almost taken our language, and you know, I'm really trying to learn Blackfoot from my grandparents, but there's a lot of work that we as Indigenous people have to do to ensure that we don't completely lose everything that makes us Indigenous, that makes us Nisitipi, that makes us whatever nation you come from.
I work with kids all the time. I got young people from this community that I watched, you know, going down because of drugs and alcohol, and said, okay, stop. I want you to do something different. I want you to come with me. I'm going to go to this conference, or I'm going to go to this event, and I want you to come and I want you to listen. I want you to listen to what Marie Sinclair has to say about history. I want you to listen to what I have to say about, you know, our communities and the impact that has been there because of things that you know nothing about, but you're going to learn. And I've watched those kids be successful because now they know something they didn't know.
One teaching that I really like is that the heart, well, something that I've come to realize, is the heart has the capacity to collapse time. 20 years can go by after you've been hurt by a parent or an auntie, and boom, it collapses all that time. You feel the same way. So that speaks to the intelligence of the heart.
Indigenous communities have a lot of work to do as well to overcome their victimization. And so that entails healing, but it also entails overcoming anger.
As Indigenous people, we have to be the educators. We have to really profess the history as it happened and not try to cover it up anymore.
The doctrine of discovery has become an almost, for some people it's almost an everyday language now, whereas before it was not. Nobody knew what it was, basically. And but nowadays there is some interest, some desire to know what it is about, even though it may not be favorable. But I think in order to have healing in our lives, and reconciliation, we have to know what Doctrine of Discovery, what it is.
The shining water that moves in the streams and the rivers is not just water, but the blood of our ancestors. If we sell you land, you must remember that it is sacred. And you must teach your children that it is sacred, and that each ghostly reflection in the clear water of the lake tells of events and memories in the life of my people. The water's murmur is the voice of my mother's mother.
I think a simple declaration of repudiation would be sufficient, but there are many who would question whether or not that would be far enough or go far enough. And within government, I think they wouldn't quite appreciate what the significance of that is, and because they don't know what the implications are, they resist the temptation to do it, or they resist the effort to do it. There are many within government who tread carefully when it comes to changing precedent. And so for that reason alone, just the fear of what it's going to do or what it's going to cause to them and how it's going to challenge Crown sovereignty, or undermine Crown sovereignty for that matter, I think it's a real question. It's a real open question.
We've come to expect that the land that we live on is ours, and that we should expect a kind of certainty in that. And I think that talking about things like repudiating the doctrine of discovery, it kind of unsettles that certainty that we've come to realize. But what I think is crucial for us is to understand that there really is another truth. And that truth is that we live on Indigenous lands, that we work on Indigenous lands. And that what we have to be about in the future is a recognition of that truth and then finding a way to move forward together in that truth.
Once you pull out the linchpin and open that door, then there are going to be all these implications that are going to follow.
In the calls to action, what we suggested, recognizing that that was going to be an area of resistance, what we suggested was, let's develop together a doctrine of reconciliation through a proclamation on reconciliation and a covenant on reconciliation, because regardless of what one thinks about repudiation and the implications of it, we can go further and redefine our new relationship through those documents as well.
When I think about the Doctrine of Discovery, the image that comes to mind, and it's not an image that I am at all happy about, but here it is: spiritual arrogance of the worst kind.
All Christian churches who relied upon the Doctrine of Discovery, a principle, I think, have to make it very clear that they're no longer relying upon that, or that they recognize the invalidity of that.
Christianity got entangled with this process of colonization. It was kind of fuel to the fire. And that's a devastating thing to come to grips with.
I think that our churches are one of the biggest institutional racism organizations in Canada. I mean, and if you look at the structure, where are the Indigenous people in that structure?
Well, I think if racism is grounded on an understanding that somehow we're going to be saved from ourselves as a people, then I think racism is rife.
I'm very proud to be a Catholic Christian and also a Mohawk woman. We as church people need to be strong enough and not to say, oh no, it didn't happen, or, well, I'm sorry. Just listen, and you don't have to say anything.
I first heard my first truth telling about experiences in residential schools in 2010, and that was a game changer. That the whole ground shifted under me. Because you can intellectualize this stuff to a certain degree, but then you hear stories from survivors, and it just, your head and your heart and your spirit connect differently, understand differently, learn differently. And it was sort of in that context that the doctrine of discovery, you can see the schools as a mechanism of this underlying concept. And so to see that written, to see that as an ideological concept that has shaped so much of not just church practice, but the history of European colonization in North America and in other places around the world, it's shocking.
It is very difficult to point and say, well, here it is. That's why the doctrine of discovery, I think, is a helpful way of describing it. It describes a systemic evil, a way in which a particularly dangerous and noxious idea becomes a part of the way people look at the world. It becomes a part of a worldview.
So as much as the churches are repudiating the doctrine of discovery, we have a larger challenge, which is a political challenge, which is to have it removed from our constitutions. And then the second part of that is, I think the theologies are still really strong within our thinking. And we haven't taken the time as church in our process of reconciliation to do that deep self-critique that is going to be necessary to change our worldview.
One of the great weaknesses of the TRC, in my mind, in Canada, is that as denominations, we're still separated. And every denomination has apologized for its mission history, I think. There have been many apologies, but we've never agreed that we would act collaboratively as people of faith.
How do we reflect on our baptismal vow to respect the dignity of every human being and to strive for justice and peace among all people? Here is an opportunity for us to talk about the history of our own church and our struggle to be faithful as a church to that kind of commitment associated with our baptism.
A Christian person as an individual has a twofold responsibility. Number one, they have to realize that they have been deeply influenced by these ideas, and they have to apply spiritual discipline and insight into resisting and countering these ideas in their own minds and hearts. And this is true for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people both. This insight, I think, helps people to begin to move into advocacy and to start promoting ideas and policies in their communities and their organizations that will counter the impact of these ideas.
You might as well expect all the rivers to run backwards, as that any man who was born free should be contented to be penned up and denied liberty to go where he pleases. If you tie a horse to a stake, do you expect him to grow fat? If you pen an Indian up on a small spot of earth and compel him to stay there, he will not be contented, nor will he grow and prosper. I have asked some of the great white chiefs where they got their authority to say to the Indian that he shall stay in one place, where the white man sees that he can go wherever he pleases, and they cannot tell me. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself. And I will obey every law and submit to the penalty.
Reconciliation, I mean, just the dictionary meaning of it means, it could mean a couple things. One, to be friendly and harmonious again. So that's a good thing. But then it could also be taken as maybe you people should just reconcile yourself to the fact that this is the way it is. And sometimes I'm concerned that the latter is the case.
Reconciliation is not about being a spectator. It's not about sitting back and waiting for government and churches and corporations and business to change the way they do things. It's about changing the way you do things too.
One of my favorite things to say is that believing in the sacred is far more rational and sustainable than the destruction of the economic paradigm. We know the economic paradigm isn't working. Why do we keep thinking that it's so powerful and it's so rational? And even Western laboratory science, it's not sustainable. We need to go back to having reverence for the land and reverence for the water and reverence for that Chaudière Falls where Creator placed the first sacred pipe, the ultimate symbol of reconciliation.
What if we're a gift? Well, we are a gift, and that our voice is important if Canada's going to understand who it is.
Everybody has to accept what they did and what had happened. And if we can get on that level, I think this world would be much more better environment to live in.
I do a lot of public education. I speak to a lot of non-Native people. I'm working with the Banff Center. We have an Allies program, and people come from all across the country. And one of the things I say to people is 97% of the population of Canada has experienced some form of trauma, and the other 3% are lying. We are all in this together.
We all share the same way of coming into the world. We all have children. We come together to raise children. We all can get together to eat together. We can pray together. We can dance together and sing together. We have to do it together, human being to human being, face to face. And can I just say, don't be afraid? Perfect love casts out fear.
Our people are so resilient, and they're still here. And there's this quote, and it's I don't remember who said it, but it's they tried to bury us, but they didn't realize that we are seeds.
As Native people, we have been sort of buried in Mother Earth, but our Mother continues to care for us, and through the gifts of all of our elements, that the seed is beginning to produce a plant that is growing, and this plant is rising above the earth.
The relationship in Canada shouldn't be so adversarial. It shouldn't be so adversarial. We're supposed to get along and mutually benefit from the wealth of this country.
Nobody's going anywhere here. We're not telling you to leave. We're saying if we are going to coexist in this land, in this territory, in this place, then we now have to talk about our terms of coexistence. What kind of relationship are we going to have? How are we going to get along here? And it's like taking a relationship of slavery and trying to turn it into a marriage.
What the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave us is a roadmap to move forward. So there's 94 answers to the question, what can I do now? 94 answers to that.
At every service, right over here in the cathedral, the dean stands up and at the beginning of the service says, we as a cathedral gather on the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. Some people think it's repetitious and we've done it and it's unnecessary, but it's that drip of water on the stone that's saying the doctrine of discovery isn't right.